Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is with great pleasure that I welcome you today, Kwabena Nketia Center for Africana Studies, for this thought-provoking discussion on black skin, white names, the place of names in decolonial cultural thought. Names are more than mere identifiers. They carry history, identity, and power. In many African societies, names reflect ancestry, spirituality, and purpose. Yet, the colonial encounter disrupted this tradition, replacing indigenous names with foreign names, often stripping individuals of their cultural heritage. Today, we gather to examine the significance of names in decolonial thought, exploring how reclaiming indigenous names can be an act of resistance, self-definition, and cultural preservation. As we engage in this dialogue, let us critically reflect on the ways in which names shapes our identities through the choices we make. I encourage you all to participate actively, share insights, and contribute to this important conversation. Once again, welcome, and I look forward to a rich and enlightening discussion. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you are well. My name is Professor Mankutam, also known as Tracy Keith Fleming. I am the acting director of the Kwabena Nketia Center for Africana Studies here at AUCB, African University of Communications and Business. We welcome you to our, fourth installment of the Global African Diaspora Lecture Series. It is with great honor and enthusiasm that I welcome you to this series at the center. I'd like to spend a short amount of time before we have an introduction of our speaker talking about the mission of the Kwabena Nketia Center for Africana Studies. This center, the Kwabena Nketia Center for Africana Studies, is committed to becoming a leading center for Pan-African scholarship and collaboration, bringing together scholars and thinkers from the African world to conduct research and deliberate on issues affecting the welfare and destiny of African peoples, and to disseminate their findings as widely as possible. Additionally, the center will be an incubator for innovative research to generate new knowledge that advances professional practice for those at the cutting edge of transformative development. The center contributes significantly to the university's mission of, quote, preparing lifelong learners to become innovative problem solvers and ethical leaders in the fields of communication, business, and related areas through excellence in interdisciplinary teaching, research, and collaboration at the local, regional, and global levels using a Pan-African framework, as well as to the university's core value of embracing African cultural values. You can read more about this mission in our AUCB strategic plan for 2022 through 2027. Some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the pillars that are in the vestibule of the Discovery House. The university is not merely a university in Africa with an African label. It is an African university with an ethos and an explicit intent to produce graduates who fully understand, appreciate, and unapologetically manifest their Africanness or their blackness. in all spheres of their life. The need to provide an education at the tertiary level that enhances the self-awareness of students as Africans led to the establishment of this center in 2009 under the name Center for Africana Studies. On the 22nd of June 2015, the Kwabena Nketia Center for Africana Studies was officially launched as an interdisciplinary institution dedicated to the creation and advancement of knowledge about the peoples and cultures of Africa and the African diaspora through scholarly research, teaching, and publication aimed at the regeneration of African peoples and societies. Ladies and gentlemen, we welcome you to the Global African Diaspora Lecture Series at the Kwabena Nketia Center for Africana Studies. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, once again. You are welcome once again to Kwabena Nketia Center. My name is Waite Jonah, and I'm going to be your MC for today. Actually, before the start of this program, went rounds and then make inquiries. We found out that most of us here don't know the reason why we are here. But today, I want to tell somebody that before you leave here, you are going to be an inspired person. As said earlier today, our topic is Black Skin, White Names, the place of names in decolonial cultural thought. And our speaker for today is Mr. Narh Tei-Kumadoe. Mr. Narh Tei-Kumadoe is a doctoral candidate at the Institute of African Studies, University of Ghana, Legon. His research interests revolve around the multifaceted dimensions of anti-colonial resistance by historical figures, ordinary people, and workers. His dissertation project is a historical examination of resistance to forced labor policies in colonial Ghana. Before joining the Ph.D. program at the Institute of African Studies, Tei-Kumadoe worked as a research and teaching assistant at the same institute. In this capacity, he served on a few research collaborations on agrarian economies of the Global South, domestic security and peacekeeping, and international labor organization project on homework in addition to teaching courses in African history, development, and music. His recent publications include an article in the Macquarie Institute for Social Research, MISR, Review 6, that is 2023, and a chapter in the book, The Unfinished Business of Liberation and Transformation, revisiting the 1958 All African Peoples Conference, that was in 2024, at the Daraja Press, Quebec, Canada. He has 2 forthcoming book chapters under the Project Oral Traditions and Expensive Diary. So, ladies and gentlemen, without wasting much time, shall we join me in welcoming our speaker for today's program, Mr. Narh Tei-Kumadoe.
Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can hear me, and thank you very much for that introduction and for the earlier introduction of. I thought, after hearing that, I thought there was no need to present the paper any longer because it seemed to have been a proper summation of whatever I'm coming to say over here. And the curious thing is, I don't even know the lady in question and how she got to produce such a good abstract or summary. I don't know how that happened, but it's all right. So before I begin, I would like to acknowledge my brother and friend, Professor Mankutam, and his efforts and initiatives. And I hope that in the coming years, this is all going to manifest in all the results that he's working towards. I also like to express a note of irony that, as you can see, here is a black skin, but when you look at my name, you see what it starts with. So let's take note of this contradiction, because we'll be visiting it closely towards the ending part of this presentation. But this work is published in the Makerere Institute of Social Research Review. It's an outcome of a doctoral school project sponsored by the Andrew Mellon Foundation. And it was a consortium of about 5 universities coming together and thinking through and analyzing decolonial approaches to research. And this research is an examination of the relationship between so this is the outline, but it's an examination of the relationship between oppression and naming or identity. Please, next slide. Because I would like next one. Yes, I want you to keep these questions you see on the screen in mind as we go, because these are the questions that this paper seeks to address. And I'm pretty sure it addresses them as best as it can. But like I said earlier, it's an examination of the relationship between oppression and naming at the outset. It poses the following questions. What's the place of names, that's personal names and names of monuments, in our encounter with colonial history? What was naming like in the years before we came under colonial domination? And what factors or processes turned on the phenomenon of black skin, white names? What purposes do these names serve historically and contemporarily? And how have liberation thinkers and workers addressed this problem? Will decolonizing African culture mean rejection of such names? Or should African culture be redefined to accommodate European influences? I hope these are not too many questions to bother your minds. But a very important part of the process of decolonization involved renaming of countries, cities, landmarks, and persons who were either key actors in the liberation struggle or ordinary people of newly independent countries of Africa. Among the countries that were renamed are Zimbabwe, which used to be Rhodesia, Zambia, which used to be Northern Rhodesia, Botswana, also used to be Bechuanaland, Democratic Republic of Congo was Belgian Congo. Prior to that, it was the Congo Free State. And then, of course, where we currently sit today, Ghana. I'm sure you all know Ghana's name during the colonial era. Okay, it used to be Gold Coast. Now, it didn't end with the names of countries. It extended to cities. For instance, Harare and Kinshasa, the capitals of Zimbabwe and the DR Congo, were renamed from Salisbury and Leopoldville. To date, there are still agitations directed at the names of some countries such as South Africa and some landmarks like Lake Victoria and Victoria Falls. Outside Africa, similar actions have been directed at renaming, the most recent being in New Zealand. The focus of this paper is the equally notable act of renaming conducted by liberation actors and notable Africans that disrupted the colonial culture of naming. Africans on the continent and beyond continue to engage with these names that entered Africa's cultural space through colonialism. They have either registered official name changes or are yet to make it legal after deciding to do away with European names. In popular culture as well, this relationship with oppression and names have featured prominently. For example, in the television series based on the book by Alex Haley, Roots, the story of Kunta Kinte, and in a record by Fela Anikulapo Kuti, Kolo Mentality. It's not by accident that liberation thoughts and actions have been directed at identities. It's a very deliberate act aimed at addressing the scourge of European hegemony, as there is no question about contestations over identity in oppressive systems generally and colonialism in Africa specifically. Naming was one way in which European modernity sought to impose itself in its colonies in the Americas and Africa. As such, personal and spatial renaming was a stand against colonial practice, which derives from European modernism, and which will be explored further in the coming sections. The Africans who changed their names were aware of what purposes naming served in their respective cultures, and saw their European names as attacks on their cultural foundations. This renaming was an important intervention against a process of subjection that could have resulted in political forgetting of cultures and all they offer. Some of these African actors were deliberate, not only in this kind of action, but also in sharing their reasons and voicing their ideas on this subject. These thoughts contribute to the broader relationship between colonization, culture, and decolonization. Now, the argument of this essay, which also sums up the reasoning behind the rejection of European names, will go as follows. To the oppressor, imposing an identity serves the purpose of disconnecting the oppressed from themselves, their time and their space. Time and space is history as well as geography. A dismemberment of one cultural identity. Take note of the term dismemberment. If this intended disconnection is successful, the broader agenda of plunder is facilitated in a manner that the following Igbo proverb illustrates. And I quote here, "The one who does not know where the rain began to beat him will most likely not know where he dried his body." To the oppressed, the quote ended, to the oppressed, their insistence on staying connected to themselves, their time and space, has always formed part of their methods of resistance and struggles for freedom. Following the proverb above, the oppressed who carries a proper sense of self-awareness will most likely stand and fight when she is being robbed of her identity. Remembering. So there's a relation between dismembering and remembering. It's not the remember that you know, although I'm sure there's a etymological relationship between those terms. To the oppressed, their insistence on staying connected to themselves, their time and space, has always formed part of their methods of resistance and struggles for freedom. Following the proverb above, the oppressed who carries a proper sense of self-awareness will most likely stand and fight when she's being robbed of identity. Remembering would restore the development of African cultural identity that entered into a phase of stagnation when it came under colonial attack. The failure of a successful remembering derives from the psychological predispositions created by colonialism. These dispositions ensure that Africans are simultaneously in pursuit of whiteness and in escape from blackness. Take note of pursuit of whiteness and escape from blackness. This phenomenon has been discussed in decolonization studies in relation to the concept of the coloniality of being. Will decolonizing African culture mean rejection of such names? Or should African culture be redefined to accommodate European influences? Yeah, I think we can. Can we step back? Can we take a. Yeah, one more step back. Back. Yeah. So now we're going to delve into theoretical perspectives on the traditions of thought and practice that distinguish what is African and what is not. And this is primarily taken from the debates between what are considered today to be the nativist school and the modernist school. Both schools address differences arising out of the colonial experience. However, their perception or analysis of difference, should I say, differ greatly. The nativist school have some of its key names to be Chinwezu, and some names that are not really associated, but they seem to be arguing along the same lines. So I include names like Ayikwe Ama, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Amilcar Cabral, Frantz Fanon. And these names argue strongly against an earlier version of nativist thought associated with Leopold Senghor, Aimé Césaire, and Leon Damas. Their common name is the Negritude movement. What these selected thinkers have in common is the need for recovery and reclamation of what European modernism, through its colonial officials, missionaries, and African agents, sought to eliminate or silence. Chinwezu and Ngugi explore this in poetry and literature, and join Ama and Cabral in offering perspective and direction to African cultural thoughts in general. A direct implication for decolonial cultural thought is that it must begin with clarity about what is African and what is European. This important distinction must be followed by action that directs cultural expression and production in continuity with that which is African. As much as possible, decolonial work must be directed at retrieving what is available from the past. To Cabral, this past must still form part of the living tradition in areas where colonial cultural imposition was unsuccessful, either in the full or marginal sense. The overall sense is that African culture must be guided away from colonial influences. In sum, celebrate what is African and reject what is European. Concerning names, this translates to a rejection of colonial types. The modernist school, for this particular paper, I selected the work of Achille Mbembe and Kwame Anthony Appiah, who regard the culture of names in Africa in their sense of, or should I say in their perspective. There's no reason to reject what's European and celebrate what's African, because the colonial encounter, for all the years that it lasted, created multiple heritage. So it's difficult to tell what is actually African and what's actually European out of the universal. The universal is a product of all the societies that clashed. This perspective pays very little attention to the place of oppression. It's an embodiment of colonial thinking, and it doesn't really offer any future for decolonial reality. Regarding the culture of names in Africa, it can be accurately read as offering support for the usurpation of the rights of parents and the wider family to name children in accordance with their own customs. In the name of universalism, one tradition should be sacrificed for the other, irrespective of the meaning that its owners attach to it. It is to these meanings associated with naming in African societies that this paper now turns. So now we can come to the significance of naming in African cultures. The study of names has been growing steadily in Africa over the years. These studies have provided insights into understanding what Africans have sought to achieve through naming, how they have constructed names, how personal names are assigned, among other insights. The works consulted in this research, drawn from Ghana, Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, and diaspora-based Africans, collectively indicate a uniformity in cultural thoughts on names. They indicate a relationship between research on names and African languages. And this opens questions about how to decolonize names in settings that still utilize colonial languages. This is an area for decolonial work to re-engage with presently and in future, and in building upon the foundations laid by Obiwale, Chinwezu, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Chinua Achebe, and among others. But now let us understand what Africans before colonialism sought to do with names. When they are naming their children, when they are naming adults who have acquired new positions and titles, what did they try to achieve by bestowing names upon people? The key objectives of bestowing names in African cultures vary. They range from a need to share worldviews, record historical events, honor the dead or the living, to acknowledge a feat by the name bearer or achievements by a deity or society. They offer social commentary, protest, and they also confer particular destinies. They also indicate geographical origins and offer protection of people, among other objectives. It must be noted that African naming traditions derive from consultative processes within the family, clans, and wider society. This combination of cultural thought, or if I should add a note of clarification, that names were not individually assigned by the parent. Once you have a child, or once you have a kin, or once you have a reason to give somebody a name, it was often preceded by consultative processes and consensus before it's moved. These days, you don't see that. These days, when I was growing up, I had a friend who, very early in life, had a son. And guess what? He named the son after his favorite hip-hop artist. But if I mention the name right now, one day he'll see this tape and come after me, so I'll not. But basically, it must be noted that African naming traditions derive from consultative processes within the family, clans, and wider society. This combination of cultural thought and practice occurs in specific languages. As such, naming is undoubtedly an avenue through which most societies grow their languages and perform poetry. Poetry can be situated in either one name or in longer appellations. Whether a poetic approach is applied or not, names serve as information sources that try to achieve the purposes mentioned above. With this stated basis in mind, names are either chosen from an existing archive or they are created. Both are dependent on the particular circumstances of birth. Some of these determinants are the day of the week. I'm sure most of you are aware of that. The position of the child among their siblings, the sex of the child, the status of the family, the notable events at the time of birth, and cases like child mortality within the family. I'm sure most of you here know of names that are given to children that come from a mother who has repeatedly lost her children. Yes. Now, names are often given based on one or a combination of these stated factors. It's quite common to find a name that combines the day of the week, the status of the family, and circumstances of birth. Names come with reciprocal expectations and responsibilities for the name bearer and the name itself. At naming ceremonies, some of these responsibilities and expectations are stated, and in the course of a person's life, certain events cause them to be restated either in joy or in grief. It's quite common today. I'm pretty sure some of you have encountered moments where an achievement will lead somebody's excited relative to say, that is why you are called so and so, right? It's quite common today to praise or caution someone by alluding to their name. The underlying purposes of names is the connection it holds for the living, the dead, and the unborn, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the connection between the person and their broader space and time, that is their society and their history. It's within this context of connection that the imposition of colonial names should be read, especially as we shall see how some of them were arbitrarily conferred by persons who had not earned the right to do so. Like I've tried to state earlier, that it doesn't just take the parent to confer a name. Quite often, it arises out of consultative processes. But with the coming of colonialism, interesting and significant changes started to take place concerning names in Africa. And it's especially important that we visit the work of Professor Kofi Asare-Opoku, who is the founder of this center, right?
No, he's one of the past directors.
Past directors of this center. In his analysis of how Christian missionaries successfully penetrated the African spiritual and cultural space, Kofi Asare-Opoku notes 3 earlier attempts to introduce Christianity in the following periods: in the 4th century, the 15th century, and the early 19th century. All these 3 attempts failed. A few factors, such as the advances in medicine, which made it possible for treatment of tropical diseases, and the post-Berlin Conference conquest of African societies, give missionary work a great push. The force of colonial rule imposed on African populations made it much easier for missionary work to flourish. Opoku demonstrates this by outlining colonial policies that emasculated the ritual leaders, priests, and priestesses. Other measures were taken to destroy their shrines, in addition to imprisoning and executing some priests. With the degree of power in force and protection it provided for the missionaries, who shared the same worldview as the colonizers, the African religious landscape was leveled for successful missionary penetration. And beyond Kofi Asare-Opoku, Chinua Achebe's novel, Arrow of God, tells a very important story about how Africans broke faith with their spiritual beliefs in the period of colonialism. This led to a widespread of missionary schools sited on the premises of churches, which African converts attended with their children, and to which non-converts sent their children. It's within this context that African children were renamed by the churches and their schools, with priests and teachers taking on these additional roles. So the responsibility of parents, the clan, and the wider family was now taken up by priests and teachers during the colonial era or in the missionary schools. The formula was to give so-called Christian names or European names as first names. In some instances, the child's original name was eliminated. In others, it was made the other name in addition to her family name. Children of converts, such as the family of Chinua Achebe, had new names much earlier in life, whereas children of non-converts, such as Ngugi wa Thiong'o and Nelson Mandela, had theirs when they started primary school. So two exhibits are drawn from colonial Kenya and South Africa to illustrate how this dismemberment, how this dismemberment of African identities began. So this exhibit A, by a man who started his publishing life as James Ngugi, later renamed as Ngugi wa Thiong'o. I wrote Weep Not Child, A River Between, and A Grain of Wheat. These are his first 3 novels, and published the 3 novels under the name James Ngugi. James is the name I acquired when I was baptized into Christianity in primary school. But later, I came to reject the name because I saw it as part of a colonial naming system, when Africans were taken as slaves to America and were given the names of the plantation owners. Say, when a slave was bought by Smith, the slave was renamed Smith. This meant that they were the property of Smith or Brown, and the same thing was later transferred to the colony. It meant that if an African was baptized, as evidence of his new self or the new identity he was given. He was given an English name, not just a biblical, but a biblical and English name. It was a symbolical replacing of one's identity with another. So the person who was once Ngugi is now James Ngugi. The one who was once owned by his people is now owned by the English. The one who was owned by an African naming system is now owned by an English naming system. So when I realized that, I began to reject the name James and to reconnect myself to my African name, which was given at birth. And that is Ngugi wa Thiong'o, meaning Ngugi, the son of wa Thiong'o. So exhibit 2. And this is by a man I'm pretty sure most of you know, Nelson Mandela. But he also has a very interesting story about his name to tell. On my first day at school, and Mandela started school when he was about 9 years old. So he had lived his life known by a certain name for the first 9 years of his life, only to walk into a school for this to happen. On my first day of school, my teacher, Miss Ndigane, gave each of us an English name and said that from thenceforth, that was the name we would answer to in school. This was the custom among Africans in those days and was undoubtedly due to the British bias of our education. The education I received was a British education in which British ideas, British culture, British institutions were automatically assumed to be superior. There was no such thing as African culture. Africans of my generation, and even today, generally have both an English and an African name. Whites were either unable or unwilling to pronounce an African name and considered it uncivilized to have one. That day, Miss Ndigane told me that my new name was Nelson. Why she bestowed this particular name upon me, I have no idea. Perhaps it has something to do with the great British sea captain, Lord Nelson, but that would only be a guess. So he was, I hope the gods help me to pronounce his original name. Sometimes I get it right, sometimes I don't get it right. But he was Rolihlahla, right? Rolihlahla. So he actually lived the early years of his life known by that name, only to go to school on the first day. And these are just exhibits of what? Of a broader and bigger phenomenon that took place with almost everybody. Unfortunately, I developed interest in this subject after my father had died. But even him, based on the kind of names that his siblings called him by, and the kind of official name that we knew him by, you could tell that something happened along the way. And many of you, maybe your grandparents who went to school, share the same story. Now, these stories of Ngugi and Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela illustrate in sharp focus the dismemberment of African identities performed in the schools in association with the churches. In a day at church or school, the identity which might hold any of the traditional purposes and connections mentioned above is either replaced or reconfigured arbitrarily. These acts of psychic violence that were visited on the African culture of naming by agents of colonialism, such as teachers and priests, meant the usurpation of the right of the parents, the family or clan to name their children in accordance with well-reasoned and established customs. In this context, parents who had been converted to Christianity and whose identities had been thus abused no longer needed teachers and priests to assign these names to their own children. The internalized religious beliefs justified the need to dismember and disconnect. It must be noted that the same goes for parts of Africa that came under Islamic influence. In addition to this, there are some cases of Africans with European ancestry, African descendants of enslavement in the Americas, Coptic Christians in Ethiopia, and Africans who subscribe to religions that came from outside the continent. With the exception of these earlier and later examples, Christianity and its relationship with the colonial governments did the most damage. It is important to note that there were some instances of people naming their children after persons they had reason to honor. Some Europeans who had conducted themselves positively with Africans had their names passed on to children. Although this dimension is acknowledged by this research, it is actually rare, if not insignificant, when read against the widespread evidence of an imperial cultural program for primary identity formation of the colonized. Now, the aims of introducing European names into African culture of naming. The ultimate aim of colonialism was economic exploitation, but it cannot be successfully achieved in the context where people were connected to their society. The extent of resistance that a colonial pursuit would encounter in this connected societal setup would make economic exploitation impossible. As such, it has always been the strategy of colonizers to invest in colonizing their victims psychologically. The colonial ground becomes relatively softened if psychological colonization is achieved. By psychology, this paper subsumes all the other dimensions of life, such as the social, aesthetic, and cultural. To understand why victims of this psychic abuse of renaming by colonial agents survived, and the abuse got transmitted down the generations, this paper draws on the work of Frantz Fanon. In Black Skin, White Masks, which is the inspiration for the title of the paper, Fanon examined the psychology of racism and dehumanization inherent in colonial dominance. One key argument Fanon makes is that the colonial policy of assimilation forced the colonized to reject their own culture and take on European identities as replacement. This occurs through a process of internalization of white propositions of what a man or woman must be, what language he or she ought to speak, as well as how to identify himself or herself. The colonial process invalidates much of what stood for an African way of being at the psychological level and creates colonized people whose entire life essence is about emulating the white colonizer. Efforts are directed at becoming like the colonizer so as to be accepted as a human being. Consequently, a situation emerges within which being African is jettisoned entirely or regulated to the background. This is witnessed in the preferences for European languages, partners, clothing, ceremonies, and drinks, among other indications. And interestingly, we still do that today. People marry 2 times in our country, forgetting that those marriages are still traditional marriages. European traditional marriage is called a white wedding, and an African traditional marriage has been reduced to an engagement. This comes from this internalized coloniality that Frantz Fanon was talking about. And it has a striking familiarity with the kind of names that we bear as well. When this psychological method of colonialism is achieved, it makes it easier to pursue the grand agenda of economic dominance. The colonized hardly become threats to the economic agenda, specifically with names. Their primary identities of the colonized, which determine what names they accept, become distorted, making it possible for people to cling onto European names without question, especially when religion is used as a decoy. So you are not taking European names, you are taking Christian names. And if you don't have them, you don't go to heaven. And nothing, the fear of hell is the most powerful thing that anybody can apply in persuading people, right? Taking a broader look at the practice of colonial oppression in earlier periods around the world, Fanon is seen to be clearly echoing the reflections of people like W.E.B. Du Bois and D. Brown. In D. Brown's book, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, An Indian History of the American West, please take note of this. which examined the relationship between European settlers and indigenous people of what became known as America. He presents instances where European settlers in America prevented the Native Americans from enrolling in school until they took on European names. In other instances, a self-educated man who had completed the required training to become a lawyer was refused a call to the bar because he did not have an European name. These illustrations of conditional belonging and continued exclusion are what Du Bois considered as double consciousness. In his book, The Souls of Black Folk, he sought to examine how racism affects the identity of its targets. After establishing the material cause of racism to be the desire for economic subjugation, he makes this seminal contribution on how it affects black identity. To Du Bois, the oppressive systems directed at black people in the USA after the abolition of slavery weighed heavily on the souls of black people, creating the situation where they could not attain their full potential. They are in constant engagement with white America about the need for their humanity to be recognized in the same way that colonialism turned continental Africans into people seeking the same recognition. This double consciousness. So I would skip here. How much time do I have?
You're fine.
I'm fine.
10 to 15 minutes.
I have 10-15 minutes. So,
I scheduled to close at 4, so you have
okay. So, I mean, the rest of this section just delves more into the literature, invokes thinkers like liberation thinkers like Amilcar Cabral, whose work and analysis were all about putting an end to the distortion and stagnation of cultures and histories inherent in the colonial system. It's from this point of view that the reactions of some notable Africans will be examined in the next section. Next slide. Rejection, silencing, and repositioning. So this is how I've tried to categorize the responses of the liberation thinkers or liberation workers. The resistance to onomastic violence, that's the violence of naming, in the broader African community, specifically in Europe and the Americas, has long experience beyond the colonial and post-colonial realities that most of the examples in this section focus on. During the period of enslavement of Africans, and as you know, based on the fact that the Christian missionaries failed in the 3 earlier attempts, they hardly had any converts. So this was not an issue in Africa until post-Berlin Conference. But a few centuries before that, the Americas was a very important theater to study the resistance to the distortion and the dismembering of people's identity. During the period of enslavement of Africans in the Americas and Europe, the source of this resistance was established through various processes that the enslaved chose to address questions of their identities. A close look at these processes illustrates diverse methods across multiple locations where enslavement was active. Studies by Laura Alvarez Lopez, Richard Burton, and Susan Benson have demonstrated these acts of resistance in Brazil, the Caribbean, and North America, respectively. These studies demonstrate with instructive evidence that the diverse means resulted in a common end, renaming, an end that sought to cast aside the oppressor's control of identities and recover their volition in naming themselves. Some involved the recovery of African names, Islamic names, and European names chosen by the formerly enslaved. A few cases of notable Africans who have confronted the problem of naming on the continent and in the broader African world, community during the colonial and post-colonial years are outlined in the following paragraphs. A broad look at the phenomenon of renaming across the world of African experience suggests three main reactions: rejection, silencing, and repositioning. For those who rejected their European names, they removed their baptismal or school names from their official records, as reflected in the passages by Ngugi and Achebe. They made definite conclusions about the nature of the system that gave them European names. It was an oppressive system backed by powers that they could not confront in their childhood. As such, it was important to expunge colonial names from their identities. Naming to them indicates ownership, and since they perceived themselves as people owned by Africa and not Europe, they proceeded to act in accordance with this belief. Ngugi and Achebe, and Achebe, were in agreement on the firm excoriation of the system of naming as akin to a farmer branding his cattle. Ngugi held that Europeans did not own him, and he had to spell out his proper name and identify by it. For him, he already had a name before he became baptized through a Christian education. This baptismal name, James, occupied a position in his identity which rendered it broken and in need of fixing. Fixing a broken identity amounted to personal decolonization, an act that served as a necessary reconnection of what was raptured under colonial naming of Africans. Chinua Achebe had a different story. He was born to Christian converts. So, from the very beginning of his life, he was known as Albert Chinomologo Achebe. And when he became an older man, he decided to drop Albert. And he did it so early in life that by the time he started publishing, the Albert didn't exist. So until he told his story, people didn't know. Other notable Africans who acted along these lines include Kwame Nkrumah. Kwame Nkrumah used to be Francis. He dropped this. Ayikwe Ama and Akilakpa Sawyer. They were both classmates in Achimota School. They were all called George in their years in Achimota School. Atukwe Okai used to be John Henry Atukwe Okai. Fumilayo Anikulapo Kuti and her son Fela Anikulapo Kuti also fall in this category. While Fela Ransom Kuti became Fela Anikulapo Kuti. So Fela's first name was not European. It was his surname that was a funny compound name which had Ransom before the Kuti. So he had to do away with it quietly. No, not quietly. Fela was a very loud person. He doesn't do anything quietly. So in his song Kolo Mentality, he actually called his father out and called him Mr. Ransom Kuti. You are all... Yeah, so Fumilayo Ransom Kuti started life as Frances Abigail Olufumilayo Thomas and died as Fumilayo Ransom Kuti. Africans born and raised in the diaspora have been active participants in this process of self-identification and anti-colonial naming. Before I come to those here in my paper, when I knew this man some years ago, he was Tracy Keith Fleming. And these days, he's Mankutam. So there you go. But there are other names like Molife Kete Asante. That's him, right? Molife Kete Asante, whose picture is hanging here, used to be Arthur Lee Smith. Kwame Ture of the All-African People's Revolutionary Party used to be Stokely Carmichael. The boxer Muhammad Ali changed his birth name Cassius Clay. So did Malcolm X, who went through renaming 2 times. From Malcolm Little to Malcolm X, and then from Malcolm X to Haj Malik al-Shabazz, after he broke away from the Nation of Islam. It's important to note that these African Americans taking on Islamic names was considered liberatory from the white oppressor and the associated Christian religion. Another example is the acclaimed philosopher Kwesi Redu, who rejected two colonial names, Johnson and Emmanuel. So when he went to Oxford University, he was called Johnson Emmanuel Redu. He proceeded to change not only his name, but the names of his children as well. George Awono Williams became Kofi Awono. And I have a tall list of people who did that. I'm still building on that list. Amata Edu used to be Josephine. It's a tall list. There's another group of Africans who have kept their baptismal or European names in their records, but have publicly silenced them. Silencing European names illustrates another degree of rejection that is comparatively mild, yet undoubtedly disruptive of colonial naming. It is done to reduce the prominence of such names and consign them to private use only. This resonates with the concept of hidden transcripts analyzed by Laura Alvarez Lopez. It was a method used by the enslaved in the Americas to resist names they disapproved of but lacked the power to rid themselves of. In post-colonial realities, however, it's more a question of will and opportune time than of power. A professor from philosophy from Nigeria, Kolawole Ogundowole, maintains the name Ezekiel, yet does not write it on any of his publications, nor use it in his public appearances. A different example is that of University of Ghana professor Kojo Amano, whose birth name was Richard Sebastian Amano Wilkes. This changed to Kojo Sebastian Amano, a rejection of a personal name and part of his surname, but the maintenance of the European name now repositioned. Take note of repositioning. In recent publications and public appearances, the European name Sebastian does not appear. This leads us to the last group of Africans who have neither rejected nor silenced, but rather repositioned their European names. Sometimes repositioning is part of the processes to transition to either rejection or silencing, as illustrated in Kojo Amano. Another notable example is the philosophy professor Kwame Anthony Appiah, who would not agree with what decolonial thinkers do, but curiously, he has a name that, going by the colonial naming system, is very unusual, because the whole point was to put the European name first, and then if you have an African name, it comes second before your family name. But he has Kwame before Anthony and Appiah. Another case is the case of the vice president of Ghana. The present vice president. At the time I wrote this paper, she was not the vice president, but she's Nana Jane Opoku Agyeman, which also strikes us as unusual because Jane should precede Nana according to the colonial naming system. But she is Nana Jane. Of course, it gets confused all the time. People call her Jane Nana, but the actual arrangement of her name is Nana Jane. Then European names were supposed to be the first on official documents, since they constituted a specific part of the subordination of African identity, and anything that had to do with Africa from a colonial standpoint. One notices the manner in which these renaming activities occur. Among continental Africans, it is predominantly attached to their specific ethnicities. Yet for Africans in the diaspora, this occurs usually as a mix of ethnic identities drawn from widely separated areas from the continent. For instance, Kwame Ture combined Akan and Mandinka names. You find the Mandinkas in the westernmost part of West Africa, in Mali, Guinea, Senegal. This is the style of naming considered as a reflection of state of Pan-Africanism. Now, I'm coming to the conclusion. This paper has argued that the phenomenon of Africans bearing European names amounts to a dismemberment of African identities, a practice that has served to disconnect Africans from themselves, their societies, and histories. What started as an abuse of children has become a normalized practice considered to be psychic violence, deriving from the impact of colonial experience. The violence remained unquestioned today due to the erasure and amnesia stemming from people's attachment to colonial religions and education. The paper has also outlined the strategies of resistance employed by those conscious of this outcome of colonialism. 3 key strategies are rejection, silencing, and repositioning of these names, in the attempt to reclaim the right to self-identification. While these 3 methods of renaming disrupt the colonial culture of naming, this paper holds that outright rejection is the most impactful. It follows the path that has been traced to the restoration of cultural development and remembering, and also connects with the earlier thought and action that stress continuity between old African culture and present cultural production. Thank you very much.
Let's thank Narh for that very insightful presentation. So we now have time for some engagement with our guest speaker. Questions, concerns, or comments? Anybody like to be the first? I have questions as well, but I will save mine until much later, or perhaps even until after we begin. Give me a sheet of paper. But we have a question here. We'll do them one by one for now. Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so it's not much more of a question, but it's just an enjoyment of the whole presentation. I can attest to how important it is to be concerned about the kind of names you are giving. Myself and my friend here, we level 300, studying Viscom, and he's studying Japan. And it's called Prince Charles Mensah. And it's much more of a reason why we decided to come and sit. Because my name is Nana Kwame Eji Nako Samuel.
Samuel
Yes.
is the last name.
Yes, but when I'm writing a certificate or any other official document, it starts with the Samuel, if you see steroids. So I was just enjoying the whole presentation thing. But I believe the naming system is not just the educational thing. It goes down to the Bible, goes down to historians and all of that. Because in Genesis, God gave Adam the opportunity to name others, and then that is what we have to do. And our parents also are doing the same. And so this presentation will help us understand much more of most of the references we were making concerning African diasporas and people who have actually decided to change their name or reposition, much more like silencing some of their names to help them maintain their indigenous African name. My questions will come, but I just want to appreciate your presentation and then sit back and draw the questions so that when there's much time for these questions, I can spread them. So God bless you. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you very much.
So now, do you want to respond, or you want to take a few more questions?
No, I just want to take a jab at Prince Charles. That's all.
I also even have something to say, but you take the job first.
Of all the names you could have been given, they gave you the name of the chief colonizer. Anyway, let's hear you.
Oh, no.
No.
It's
It's just a jab. That's all.
that probably maybe our fathers loved the way the Western world went, because I personally have asked my parents why they had to combine 2 English names, and you know the prominent person that Prince Charles. So
You were named after him, I'm sure.
exactly.
So it's not a combination of names.
Listen again.
It's not a combination of names. You were named after Prince
So I
Charles.
asked him why, and he said at that time he liked the demeanor of the man. That is why he named me after the man. And recently I got to see the man recently. He's very old. And I look at him, I'm like, you named me after this old man. Because I even thought probably he was very young and like his sons, Prince William and the rest. But you look at the man is very, very old.
Yeah.
So now even when people call me Prince Charles, I don't really feel the vibe in it anymore like that. But But it's already part of my name. I have nothing to do. Within year,
Tracy, sorry, Mankutam, just take a step back. Prince Charles, please read up. You have an option. You have options. You are not done. I mean, you didn't have power when you were given, but it's for you to decide if you want to carry this, you know. And he's a very, I don't know how much you read about him, but yeah, it's one thing, he's the king of England, but before he became king of England, he's been associated with a whole lot. And he comes from a family of a whole lot. And actually, they are doing a whole lot to the son who has married a woman who is not white. So it's up to you to figure it out.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Excellent. So additional questions, comments, feedback. I'm sure I've seen a lot of people talking amongst themselves, so feel free. This is a safe space.
Okay, so once again, I want to appreciate your work. But my concern is, from your presentation, I've realized all those that dropped their European names were all scholars. Okay, so my question is, now you know of it. You are Mr. Eric Narh Tei-Kumadoe. Okay, you know of it. But yet still, you are carrying that name. Why? I want to know if you wanted to become a scholar before you drop it, or like what's the benefit?
Well, so you want to hear my personal story? Of why I still carry Eric? Well, I made an attempt to drop it some time ago, but I was just quietly advised that it could be disruptive of the current educational pursuit I find myself in. I'll need to justify why I'm changing my name to whoever. So I felt that the right time should come. After I've graduated, I'll be free enough to do whatever I wanted to do. But in natural fact, it's just for official purposes that I have to keep writing the Eric. I mean, when I met this man, I didn't introduce. For how many years now, I don't introduce all the new people I'm meeting. I don't introduce myself to them as Eric. So I'm very much in the process. I support the rejection of European names because, like I've tried to argue as clearly as possible, they are not real heritage. They are disrespectful impositions and distortions, and we would have to address them. Yeah? So, Boete, you are Boete, right? You don't have one of those. You are Jonathan. Okay, that's fine. Prince Charles, you want to come again? It's good. If people are still feeling embarrassed based on the presentation, I think I've done my work.
So in your submission, if I remember very well, you stated that, when they brought religion, they stated that if you don't have a Christian or an English name, you might not go to heaven. Is that what you said?
Yeah, I said that.
Okay. So would you say that our forefathers, because looking at the stories that we heard about our forefathers, they were people who were very intelligent. So were they blinded by these white people? Because I don't understand how a God who creates you will say that if you don't have an English name, you won't go to heaven. Right now, heaven is based on the English name you carry. and it's giving a tag to the, some of us who are in the Christian world. Because I think that we had a trip to, which castle did we go to? Yeah, the Cape Coast Castle. And on top of where the slaves were, they had a church over there. And they questioned my Christianity. I felt like, this God I'm serving, the God that they brought to us, they were serving the God at the same time. They were having inhumane things over there, right below where they were serving the God. So, our forefathers were they asleep or like? I want to understand because you look at these great names that they had or said to two and the rest, and you are losing your integrity to just a simple thing like this.
So that's a very interesting way of looking at it. All right, that leads you to question the intelligence, or is it agency or initiative of the people who were caught up in this period. But here's the point: the colonial period was not a time that offered people to act in line with their full potential. It was an extraordinarily chaotic era. Now, when you live in chaos, there is one likely outcome, that your efforts become limited to survival rather than insisting on your way and what is right and what is not. Do you get it? Yeah. Now, living for survival really hardly has much room for whether the person is intelligent or not. I'm pretty sure if we assemble the most intelligent people here and put a lion in this room, their reaction would be the same, right? So, I mean, that's about what I would say. It doesn't take away from their intelligence, but the chaotic nature of the colonial encounter and the encounter with enslavement in other parts of the world, in the diaspora, created some of these things. So their intelligence emerges in how they manage some of these things. For instance, my father named me Eric. He never called me by that name, right? So you ask yourself, why did you give the name but you are not using it anyway? That's where you see their agency, and that's where you read their intelligence from. Just as I said, in the years of enslavement in the Americas, people responded openly to their slave names, but in private, they didn't associate with those names at all. So here are a few notes on intelligent strategies that were used to cope. Yeah.
I'm a Muslim.
Yes, sir.
I don't know my side. I don't want to go deep. If I go deep, something may happen.
What will happen? What will happen?
By changing it, like, it's about before I will be convinced of what you are saying. Do you have case?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Mm.
Would you like to name them after the European?
Man, why would I do that?
So, what if maybe you give birth and your child name his son or daughter?
Mm-hmm.
What will you do to your son?
Oh, what can I do to my child?
Okay.
I mean, what can you do? The only thing you can do is to hope and train the person the way you think they should live their lives. But if they decide to rebel, I mean, I'm a rebel.
Okay.
By taking down my first name is an act of rebellion, is it not? What can my father do? Or what can my mother do?
But see.
So if my child does it, what can I do?
Our era is a Gen Z era.
Yeah.
And if you give birth to me,
Mm-hmm.
and you don't give me that European name, I'll be in class. Like how you mentioned Nelson Mandela's name.
Yeah.
The middle name,
Rolly, klakla.
and I'll be in the class, whereby maybe they will be teasing, be mentioning the names. I'll be yeah. And due to that, I can't just put blame on you because you didn't do good to me at all. Yeah. In our era, maybe in your era you can continue.
I'm not too sure what difference there is between your era and my era. But this is
You have BBC.
what is BBC?
Born before computer.
Are you sure? Are you sure? Do you know when computers were invented?
Okay, sorry.
How do you know I'm a millennial, by the way?
Our era is bigger than billion.
Well, here's the thing.
You are carrying the EI.
Here's the thing. Here's the thing. I think the most important point here, the most important point from what you have said, is that every individual ought to recognize or come to a clear understanding of who they are. All right? And if you come to a clear understanding of who you are, it's going to lead you, right, to take the decisions that you have to take in accordance with who you are. Okay? If you identify by Gen Z, that in itself is a primary identity. And I generally find the most amusing thing about these generational tags, I ask myself, where do they come from? Where do these generational tags come from? Are they universally valid? Just because somebody sitting in Europe or the US claim they are Gen Z, does that make you Gen Z as well? Do your peculiar experiences as an African boy or girl growing up in this era, do they align perfectly or even remotely with the experiences of people out there? Are you with me?
Yeah.
So I, as a person, I reject these generational tags. I mean, I don't want to go into the negative perception attached to them, but yes.
I didn't hear much of the Muslims. Why?
You didn't hear much of the Muslims?
Yeah.
No, I think there was a part where I did mention that when Africa came under Islamic influence, this change of names took place. But Christianity became dominant. It took control of wider portions of the African continent, and with it, that influence. And I also did mention at a point in North America that because of the peculiarity of the oppression that took place over there, Africans were taking Islamic names as a liberatory or resistant move against the white Christian European settlement in the US. And I mentioned Muhammad Ali. You all know Muhammad Ali, don't you? Yeah. You are Gen Z, but at least you heard of Muhammad Ali. Stink like a bee, float like a butterfly. No, I don't. I mean, I'm using it just for communicative purposes. I don't take it seriously at all. But what I wanted to say, you guys were young. You guys were born at a time where Ali's heroism must have died down. But you remember him. And you know Malcolm X as well, right? And these are people who took on these names. And these are just, the examples are just symbolisms of wider phenomenon, right? In the nation of Islam, anybody who joined there had to adopt a certain naming culture, right? Yeah. So I did address Islam.
Excellent. Do any of the ladies have any questions? I noticed that mostly men are talking today. Any ladies before the gentlemen? Wow. You see? So because you do your naming.
In African context, it's the men that
It's the men that do names. But you have names, so we want everyone to have an opportunity who may have a burning question but may feel there's not time. Any ladies, gentlemen?
Okay, so I think we'll still have a time to enjoy a second one or such discussion concerning it. I don't know, but I will definitely see one of these days because I feel there should be another writing on something like I was trying to write them down, like reclaiming our indigenous name, contribution to a movement of decolonization and something, and cultural revival or something. Just to I enjoy my Ejenya so much because of what I was told about it. I'm also growing up because of my work. I've even been given something else that is way I'm called Walker in the social space. It's much more to other reasons.
Yeah,
so
Walker.
I'm just so I'm just hoping that we have some presentation of such kind. But I believe there should be a way that gradually the cultural context as to which we find ourselves can influence this naming. Because I don't know, I've never heard most of our chiefs and our kings. Should I use king? No. Yeah. Yes.
Kings.
Bearing,
not chiefs.
Yeah. Yes. Bearing these names, these Europeans' names. And I don't want to dedicate that to the authority that they have, but I believe they know why they don't want to even go into that. I don't think Osei Tutu would.
Which Osei Tutu are you talking about?
The
living Otunfo?
Yes, Otunfo would, even if he should have one, would publicly stand to pronounce them. I don't think so.
I mean, Asante culture was one of the most resistant to European, to British colonialism. He doesn't have one. His private name is Nana Kwekujia.
That is, I was telling
and he doesn't have one.
So we should find a way, or going on researches to be made. I don't know how I can make a research through my specification, but I'll still see, so that we can adapt to changing this naming ideology within our African context. Thank you.
So in the post-independence years, there's a study by Professor Kofi Ejekum, who made us know that, I don't know what is trendy these days. But is it by calling yourself Gen Z? Is it a particular way of? But he said that within that period, that immediate post-independence era, most students who were admitted to University of Ghana considered it a prestigious rite of passage to change their names, right? And at the time, they had a journal that was publishing all of these name changes, right? So, Nana, right?
Yes.
So, the independence fever triggered a new culture of naming. Of course, I mean, we all know what happened to the end of the first regime and the supervised burning of books, the supervised grabbing of books. And I'm pretty sure it also came with a serious crackdown on the anti-colonial culture, not just on the Nkrumah culture, because Nkrumah was an anti-colonial actor. So you couldn't have attacked him and his legacy without attacking anti-colonialism. You understand? Yeah, but at the moment there's a curious development in the naming sphere where Christians would want to call their child blessing or victory or grace, but they don't use the English names. They convert blessing to Inshira or Jomo or Jomi, right? My brother, who is a reverend minister, named his child Jomi when he could have used blessing. I don't know if it's a decolonial move, but so I'm seeing the emergence of these things. I don't know what's it signaling, but in addition to your earlier point, this is going to be my commitment for quite a while. So in my current paper I'm working on, which is on a continuation from this one, I'm bringing together a bigger album of people who changed their names. In there you see that it wasn't just scholars. Well, it was you who mentioned that there were scholars, right? Oh, it was you. It wasn't just scholars. A lot of ordinary people did it as well. A lot of ordinary people. Just that we tend to use names of people who are easily relatable to everybody. That's why. But it was a phenomenon that many... Imagine what Kofi Ejekum said was taking place in Legon those years. That every year a student comes to school. Every year a new group of students come to school. A good number of them change their names. Those are ordinary people whose stories you'd have to search hard to find. But it's been available, you know.
So I think we have time for one more question. Yes, madam.
Okay, so I think that the continuous talk of English names is what is affecting the change because I have younger cousins who are Ishira, Asida, and Beda. I have other ones who have two English names. That I don't know why. But for me, my mom told me she named me Daniela because a particular person helped her. And because of the meaning the name has, that's why she named me Daniela. So I feel like sometimes the meaning of the name too is the reason why they give it, but not necessarily the fact that it's English or it's European. So she keeps telling me, so this man helped me, he was called Daniel. But because I wanted to name you, I can't call you Daniel, so I did it Daniel. And then she would give me the meaning. So she took my brother's English name from the Bible. She says if you go to this part of the Bible, you would find it there. But we don't call it that all the time because it's hard to pronounce. People spoil it.
What was the first part of your comment? I lost that.
I was saying that the continuous talk of English names is what is making people change from blessing to Asida because I have siblings
Okay.
who have.
Oh, so you are saying that people who are fighting the system like me are
I'm saying you.
no, I'm not saying, and I'm not saying me too, but I'm saying that you are simply saying that people are seeing the need to shift away from
Yes. Like my
English name to
to him, he feels there's no English
yes.
name. Right?
And I also I recognize being named after somebody because the person was good. But the whole point of, or a part of the argument I'm trying to make is that colonial disruption, in whichever positive light you see it, cannot be divorced from what it sought to achieve, which was what? Distortion, subordination, reduction, and dismemberment of African identity. You ask yourself why that is why such names are in our personal archives in the first place. Why do we live in our world? And when we are consulting our archive of names to give to our children, we have an European archive, right? And then you can look out into the world. Go to Europe. What archives do they have in Europe? Do they have an African archive? So if an African did something good to, so if an European did something good to an European, and an European decides to name their child after the person who did them good, the possibility of an African name would not exist. Do you get it? Are you with me? So the question is more about why they are in our archives and we are not in theirs. And there is a problem with that relationship. And that problem ought to be resolved. Right? Okay. There's another question. I think the ladies are now coming to the table.
Yeah, we are running out of time, but please, let's
Okay, so first of all, you said you are also fighting the use of colonial names. So I want to ask you personally, are you also going to gazette your name or maintain it like that? I mean, the first name, Eric.
I've already said that. So originally there's another question from a lady. So my school name is. Are you done with your question? Are you done with the question?
Yeah, I also want to ask you that, do you think it will be possible for us to fight or change this colonial thing? Do you think it is possible?
Okay.
To fight it?
All right. So to your first question, which is my personal, so when I also grew up knowing a certain name. On the day they took me to school, I got to discover that I was called Eric, and I know for a fact that I would not return to where I came from with the European name that I carry, because they will not recognize me from there. So I'm going to restore my original name, and then case closed. Do you get me? Now, secondly, can we fight the European? What happened in 1957? What happened in 1960? In 1960, about 16 African countries regained independence. Do you get it? So, can we fight this colonial thing? Yes, a long time ago we took back our destinies and our lands, right? We lost it, yeah. But the seeds of struggle have never died, right? And because those seeds exist, at some point, oppression would have to give way. And it's curious, depending on which eyes you're looking at it, but it looks as if in the biggest theater of oppression, they are more keen on tearing themselves apart as we speak now than ever. So you give it 5 years and see whether the colonial powers you see today, you see them anymore. So the battle can be won, definitely. It's not an unwinnable battle. And in addition to that, no empire has lasted forever. No colonial establishment has lasted forever. It has always ended with the collapse of the empire or the collapse of the colonial setup. Maybe it's a different story when we come to settler colonies. Okay? But even with that, depending on the majority, the population distribution, the story could be different, right? For instance, in South Africa, you think the inequality and the injustice of apartheid would reign forever? At some point, the struggle was definitely going to overcome it. That's how I see it. Yeah. There was another hand here. The ladies are coming to the table very late. Oh, she's already asked a question.
Make your name official, you have to swear in as your name.
Mm-hmm.
So that one, it means it's not possible because you can't make it official. And then the process that you have to go through, because I've tried it once, it's too long. It's not saying you pay money and stuff. So it's better to save yourself that stress. It's better you maintain a name like that. And then maybe you call yourself the indigenous name at home. Because in official documents, you have to go and swear in as your name.
So you should, silence. You should silence it at home. But it depends on how much it means to you.
If you want to change, then it means our leaders should also try to do something about it.
We'll have to talk about our leadership at another time. But those who did it, it wasn't a big deal to them. I've given you a tall list of names, haven't I? It wasn't a big deal to them. Yeah, you swear an affidavit, you effect the change. And at least if you still have official documents that have your name, it's very important to carry them along. For instance, if I change my name now, I have it on my passport. My passport will expire in 8 years. If the passport, I'm hoping the 24-hour economy will make it possible for me to change the passport. If it doesn't, I need to carry that passport till it expires. But I have another name, right? So I need to carry it along until the passport I hold expires. Then now I can effect the new change, the new name on the new passport. So it depends on, back to the earlier point, it depends on your understanding of who you are and your place in the scheme of things and who you should be and the symbolisms that are associated with who you are. The depth of this realization should lead you to do what you have to do to achieve a rejection of the colonial system of behavior and thinking. Yeah.
So let's give him a round of applause. Intellectually stimulating presentation as well as engagement with our audience. So let's give ourselves a round of applause.
All right. Once again, we want to appreciate each and every one of you. You are warmly welcome. We thank you for your presence being here. We want to appreciate our guest. We are highly honored for your presentation you brought to us. Me myself here, I've learned a lot. And I'm praying it's going to take effect as I'm going on. And then I want to appreciate my colleagues, the level 300 student friends, and then Samuel. And then we haven't level 200 also here. Actually, they weren't having class today, but they've managed to come and then join us. We appreciate you. And then thank you too for coming. Without you, this program wouldn't have taken session. We thank you. And then hoping to see you next time.